Yo, what is up? Today we are doing Introduction to the CSS Grid challenges from Free Code Camp. So let's begin. This is a HTML style controller. That's what cascading style sheets are. So this is a cascading style sheet, CSS. And today we're learning one of the many functions, you could say, which is the grid layout options. So here we have 5 elements that are all displayed in 5 rows right here. So that's being created by these 5 div elements here. So we have div class, the main div that they all reside in has the class container, and then here they all have these classes D1 to 5, which are being defined in the CSS. And because you're just layering them one after another, they show up as columns, or rows rather. So they want you to add your code below and above these 2 lines. So for this, they want us to use the grid class. So there's a property called display. The display wants to be set to grid. So that's what they're introducing in this challenge, just to make it a grid display, which doesn't change anything. But now, because the display is grid, we can now control it further from that. So display is grid. So now display is still grid, but now because of that, here it's going to say we can do grid template columns. So then the template for the grid will be a column template, and they're going to be 50 pixels apart, wide each. So in this challenge, they want to make 3 columns that are 100 pixels wide each. So grid template columns, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels is how you write that. And now we have these 3 change so that they are 100 pixels wide each. And there's only 3 rows, or 3 columns, keep mixing it up, 3 columns, because we only gave 3 numbers here in the, I'm not sure what word to use in the definition of the grid template, or in the specification. There's probably a technical word you're supposed to use for CSS, but I cannot recall. Okay, on to the next thing. The grid you created in the last challenge will set the number of rows automatically. To adjust the rows manually, use the grid template rows property in the same way you use the grid template columns. So now we can control the rows also of the grid template. And they want 2 of them that are 50 pixels each. So they're going to get slightly bigger there, if you caught that. They were around, before this line, they're going to be 40 pixels, the font, plus some arbitrary buffer, which looks to be maybe 2 or 3 pixels. And now we're enforcing 50 on the width of these elements, and they're gonna grid elements, and they're gonna be, so they're gonna get slightly bigger now because there's buffering is now equal to 5. That's one way to look at it. Okay, on the next thing. You could use absolute and relative units like pix and m in CSS Grid to define the size of rows and columns. You can use these as well. fr sets the column or row to a fraction of the available space. Auto sets the column or row to the width or height of its content automatically. Percent adjusts the column or row to the percent width of its container. Here's the code that generates the output in the preview. Grid template columns auto, 50 pixels, 10%, 2fr, 1fr. So what this is going to do is it's going to be I believe that's 5 columns here. So 1 is going to be the automatic one, which is just the default buffering around the font. This is column spacing, so that's why there's not much. I can start as 1. 2 is going to have 50 pixels. So here, there's it's pretty much all the way to the left of the thing. There appears to only be buffering on the up and down, so that's interesting. Here has a bit extra. Okay, so see what's happening. It'll reside in the top left, and then any extra space will just be added to the right or down. So here you can see the extra is just being added right here. And this one, the extra is being added here and here. Okay, so you have 2 is now being 50 pixels wide. 3 is going to be 10% of the entire thing, entire width here. If we move this, well, so you can see it expand. It's dynamic, because 10% can be almost nothing, or it can be a lot, depending on how wide it is. But for the 1 and 2, they will always be, they can't get any smaller, because they are being defined automatically by the size of the 1, which is giving it a pixel value, and the 2 is being defined as 50 pixels no matter what. So the 3 being 10%, well, if it's 10 pixels, it'll be 1 pixel. If it's less than 10, it'll be less than 1 pixel. So it means it'll go away eventually. And then 2 fraction means that it'll be 20% of the entire thing, or is it of the remaining space? FR, a fraction of the available space. Okay. And this will be 1. The remaining space is divided into 3 sections. 2 are allocated for the 4th column. So it's the remaining space. So when you have all these fixed values, it's going by the remaining space for these FR values. So of this remaining space, 2/3 go to 4 and 1/3 goes to 5. So the container class should have a grid template columns property that has 3 columns with the following widths. They want us to do 1 FR, 100 pixels, and 2 FR. So there you go. So far in the grids you have created, the columns have all been tight up against each other. Sometimes you want a gap between the columns. To add a gap between the columns, you use the grid column gap property like this. Grid column gap 10 pixels. So you can also use FR, or no, sorry, you can only use pixels in this one, I think. Okay, so grid, let's find out, let's test it. Column gap. Let's try 5 pixels. There's a gap. Can we do 2M? Yes. We do 2FR? No. We do 10%? Yes. Okay, so we can use M pixels and percent. They want 20 pixels. So there we go. There we go. Submit and go to the next challenge. You can add a gap in between the rows of a grid using grid row gap in the same way that you added a gap in between columns in the previous challenge. Create a gap for all the rows that is 5 pixels tall. So now we're just making a gap between the rows. Grid row gap. They want 5 pixels. There we go. Excellent. Okay, now they want grid gap is a shorthand property for grid row gap and grid column gap from the previous 2 challenges that's more convenient to use. If grid gap has 1 value, it will create a gap between all rows and columns. However, if there are 2 values, it will use the first one to set the gap between the rows and the second value for the columns. use grid gap to introduce a 10 pixel gap between the rows and a 20 pixel gap between the columns. So now you can just combine them both into grid gap, and it will go rows then columns. So grid gap 10 pixels, 20 pixels will be 10 for the rows, 10 for the columns. I spelled that wrong. Grid grap. What the hell's a grid grap? Grid gap. 10, 20. Very good. Okay, I'm going to go make a nice cup of tea. It's very early in the morning. And I'll return for more of this later. Hope you enjoyed that video. Like, comment, subscribe to Moop Code Zone. And thank you for watching. If you want private coding tutoring, you can send an email to the link below. And if you want to support these videos, there's a Patreon and a donation link below also. Also, check us out on social media.